In part two, we saw that male musicians, for the most part free, traveled in a variety of different directions looking for patronage. We saw that Christian musicians had traveled down to Cordoba, where they taught Sulaim, one of the court musicians there, and we noted that Hassan ibn Ziyad had come from North Africa, possibly even further south in Africa, traveled to Cordoba, sang there in the court for several years, then traveled north, spent years among the Christian kingdoms, and came back to Cordoba. Saida was an example of someone from Cordoba who learned music and ended up traveling to the eastern Mediterranean. And of course, we saw the example of the female slave singer Qalam, one of the Qiyan, who was originally Basque, had been captured at an early age, shipped across the Mediterranean to Medina, where she was trained in music, singing, and other arts of entertainment, and then shipped back to Iberia, where she was purchased and became a figure in the court of the Emir Abdurrahman II. We also noted Ziryab, the famous black singer, who we know came from Baghdad, although what his ethnic origins were are quite unclear, and he traveled from Baghdad to Tunisia and then to Cordoba. And at the end of part two, we spoke a little bit about this whole class of female singer, musician, entertainers called the Qiyan, and noted that they were sometimes captured as captives in battles such as the siege of Barbastro, but they were also given as gifts between nobles, between princes, etc. So they formed another network within these courts and noble houses. So in this part three, what I'd like to talk about are official, professional musicians, the Muslim and Jewish musicians who were hired and performed in the Christian courts of the North. Yet another way in which music was interacting between various different groups and various different traditions. We've seen a number of images from the famous 13th century songbook called the Cantigas de Santa Maria that was either written or composed or more probably simply patronized, paid for by Alfonso X, who was known as El Sabio, Alfonso the Wise. This is perhaps the most famous image from this collection of songs. You may even have seen it before, and it clearly represents a Moor, that is a Muslim of Arab or Berber background on the left, and a Christian on the right, who are performing together in the court of Alfonso El Sabio, Alfonso X. Many people have said that this represents two different minstrels, a Moorish and a Christian minstrel. Some people have commented on the fact that the Muslim is presented with bare feet, whereas the Christian is presented with wearing shoes, and a variety of interpretations have been put forward about all of this, but personally I think that they have missed a very important detail, and that is that the Christian here is wearing a sword. Now, no minstrel would have been allowed to perform with or even carry into the court a sword or to walk into the court armed. So my personal hypothesis is that this actually represents a Christian of some rather high status. Not only is he wearing a sword, but he is wearing a very fancy, perhaps bejeweled headdress. I'm not sure I'd want to call it a crown. And I think maybe the message here is both musical but also social, showing that it is the upper class of the Christian kingdoms who had enough familiarity with the high-class music of the Muslim South that they could actually perform together. As for the fact that the Muslim is barefoot and the Christian is wearing shoes, this is just a reflection of basic habits where Muslims, Arabs, very often take off any type of footwear as they enter into an interior space. There are many other images that show Muslims and Christians together, and also show barefoot Muslims with shod Christians. So this songbook, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, was put together during the reign of Alfonso X el Sabio. Unfortunately, we really do not know much about music in his court. But we do know quite a bit about music in the court of his son, Sancho IV of Castile. So he was the eldest son and the successor to Alfonso X el Sabio. And in one financial record, we see that he has 27 court musicians. That is, these are people who are salaried musicians who are resident in the court. And interestingly enough, it breaks down into sort of an image of the Iberian Peninsula. He has 13 Christian musicians, 13 Moorish or Arab or Muslim musicians, and 1 Jewish musician, although that Jewish musician is also listed with his wife. So we might say two Jewish entertainers. This is a very interesting thing, of course, because we have to assume that these Moorish musicians or Andalusian musicians are being paid to perform their music. Why would you pay Arab or Muslim musicians to perform music of your own tradition of the Christian North? And we can see yet again that these musical traditions are just rubbing up against each other, interacting with each other in a continuous fashion during this period of time, which we might call the Age of Minstrels. But those musicians that were performing in Sancho's court are just the tip of the iceberg. We have financial and historical documentation of Moorish and Jewish musicians performing in all of the listed courts here from the mid-13th century all the way through to the mid-15th century. So for 200 years, we have continuous representation of Arab music and Judeo-Arab music in the Christian courts of the north. The reason we see more evidence from Aragon and Catalonia than from Leon and Castile is that almost miraculously the financial records of this period of time of the royal house of Aragon and Catalonia have been preserved almost intact. So we can go through and find amazing details about how much these musicians were paid, what type of clothing they were asked to wear, how much it cost to repair instruments. So we really get a wonderful, detailed description of life in these courts from the 13th through the 15th centuries. Let's take a couple of examples and let me show you the type of detail that we have from this period of time. This is an image of Pedro IV of Aragon and Catalonia. Pedro is on the right. Jesus is the large figure in the center, and his wife, the Queen, Pedro's wife, the Queen, is on the left. And as you can see, Jesus is handing the Eucharist to the Queen. But this is Pedro there on the right. Here is a coin that was struck during his reign. Probably not a very good likeness, but it's sort of interesting to be able to see his face as it was portrayed during his lifetime. He was nicknamed the Ceremonious, El Ceremonioso, and that is because he was very interested in the protocol and the workings of the court. And one of the laws that he established was a law that forbid performances by minstrels and singers during the period of Lent before Easter. So we will come back to this particular law a little bit later in the presentation. One of the records that we have from Pedro IV is that in 1337 he wrote to the city of Játiva, which is down in the south where the population is still Muslim, asking that a certain Ali Esigua, a juglar, that is a minstrel, and a rabab player, the rabab being the fiddle, the bowed fiddle, right, be sent to him. One of the things that I find so striking about this is that here is a king up in Aragon and Catalonia, and he's writing down to the south, not just asking for any musician, but he knows the name of the musician, and he requests that particular rabab player, that particular musician, be sent to him. The city council of Khatibah, of course, was very pleased and wrote back to him saying, yes, we're very happy to send you Ali Afigwa, but because we don't want him to travel alone, we're sending a flute player with him as well. And we have the financial records for when they arrive. They're given a gift to begin with, then they're given a monthly salary, they're incorporated into the court, and they perform for a number of months, I think it's 8 or 9 months, before they request permission to return home, and then they're given another payment to help them to pay them for their travels back down to the south. The rabab, this fiddle that we have been talking about, by this point in the 13th century, actually had taken a number of different forms, and it's difficult to know exactly what each one of these were called because these different images do not have a caption or a label. But all of these are forms of bowed fiddles that were found in Iberia in the 13th century. Here is one, you can see, which is an oval shape. Here is another type that we have already seen playing opposite an Arab lute, which is sort of an elongated pear-shaped. Here is another form. We also took a look at this earlier, but notice that this is almost rectangular at the top and then rounded at the bottom. His successor, the successor of Pedro IV, was Juan I of Aragon, who was known as the hunter, al-Cazador, who also continued with the love of Judeo-Arab music in his court. Here's an example from the official correspondence that we have from his reign. On June 12, 1389, the king wrote to Valencia, which of course is down in the south, also where the population is still very Muslim, asking for several Moorish joglaresas, female minstrels of the al-Fulay family, be sent to his court, and on September 9th of that year he ordered that they be paid so they could return home with his permission. In that first letter on June 12th, it's very clear that he's familiar with this family as well. So this isn't the beginning of their history with the court of Aragon, but fascinatingly enough, we can trace the comings and goings of the member of this family for several generations and through the reigns of 3 different kings in Aragon and Catalonia. Fernando of Aragon, who is 2 kings later on, some 24 years later, wrote down to Lleida, another city, asking for these same minstrels, the al-Fulay minstrels, or perhaps their descendants at this point, since so many years have passed, and he asked that they be sent to him at the city of Saragossa for an event that would take place on January 12th, noting in passing that they also used to entertain his uncle, King Martin, his predecessor, who died in 1410. So we know that this family performed regularly during the reign of Juan I the Hunter, King Martin, and then his son Fernando of Aragon. A fascinating relationship between the northern Christian court and musicians of the Muslim south. Fernando also invited other Moorish musicians and dancers to perform for him. 10 months after that first message, he writes to Valencia again, asking that a particular female dancer be sent to him. In January of 1418, he gives an order that 14 Moorish performers, a mother, a father, their son, and his wife, whom he refers to as the Casa Nostra, that is, musicians of his own court, of our own house, and he asks that they be given a Christmas gift of 20 gold florins. Alfonso of Aragon, yet the next king in the line, in 1425, sends money down to the south to cover a troupe of Moorish dancers and musicians from Khatibah, asking them to travel to his court and to perform for him. I don't want to overemphasize the presence of Moorish and Jewish musicians from the south in the court of Aragon and Catalonia, because it was an extremely cosmopolitan music center. So during the stays of these Moorish and Jewish juglares, minstrels, there were also minstrels from all across Europe. France, Portugal, Bavaria, Bohemia, Navarra, Majorca, England, Valencia, Cyprus, Flanders, Armagnac, Sicily, Austria, Germany, Scotland, and many other places in the Iberian Peninsula. So although Arab music, Andalusi music, Moorish music, whatever we want to call it, was present in the court of Aragon and Catalonia and also in the houses of the nobles, this was at a time when there was a tremendous mixing of music from different parts of Europe. These minstrels came, stayed for periods of time, and then continued their travels or returned home. The next king, we're jumping back now into the 14th century because of a fascinating a network that was established during the month of Lent. If we remember that Pedro IV of Aragon and Catalonia had made a law that said that minstrels were not allowed to perform during Lent. So what emerged and existed for between 150 to 200 years was what is referred to as the School of Flanders, Las Escuelas de Flandes, right? The minstrels of Spain and minstrels from all over, from Italy, Germany, England, and even further north, gathered in Bruges, in Flanders, in what is now Belgium, and spent several weeks together performing, learning from each other. We don't actually know what happens in this quote-unquote school, but minstrels from all over are in contact. And here's one interesting letter that we have. The Infante Juan, so he's the crown prince, he later becomes Juan I of Aragon, right, organizes the performance of his minstrels for the King of France in Paris on their way to Flanders, and asks that they buy a particular type of musical instrument called the rota. In English, this is sometimes called the crowd, and to bring an example back of it when they return. I am very happy that there are Spanish and Catalan scholars who are able to go through the primary historical sources and documents and trace out this type of correspondence between princes and kings and nobles and musicians. Here, in fact, is a letter referring to the voyage of of 5 of his minstrels to the schools of Flanders. And as you can see, it is just a little bit difficult to read. So I'm very appreciative of my Spanish and Catalan colleagues who have done most of the groundwork in this area, from which I can benefit. Very quickly, I want to point out what happens in the remaining years from the 15th century to the final conquest and expulsion of both the Jews and of the Moors or Arabs. In 1492, of course, the Kingdom of Granada, the last Islamic kingdom in the peninsula, is conquered by Isabel and Ferdinand, and very soon thereafter they expel the Jews, seizing almost all of their wealth, particular gold and jewels, etc., because they were expelled and the Jews were not allowed to carry with them anything of high value. So they could not take with them money, gold, jewels. The Muslims of Granada in the peace treaty were offered the right to practice their religion for eternity, that they would not be restricted in their practice of their religion. Eternity, however, turns out to have lasted exactly 10 years. In 1502, the Muslims of Castile, that is the kingdom ruled by Queen Isabel, were forced to convert. They were either to convert or they had to leave. Many times people ask me, well, if they really believed in their religion, why didn't they leave? Well, the answer to that is in the fine print, and that is that they would have to have left, abandoning all their wealth, that is their gold, jewels, silver, etc., and also their children, so that the Catholic Church could save their souls and raise them as good Catholics. So many people chose to at least pro forma convert, and become what are called Moriscos, continuing to speak and sing in Arabic and gather for music and dance in sambras, from the Arabic word samra, these musical gatherings. But I want to point out that King Ferdinand was not nearly as harsh on his Muslim subjects as Isabel was, and Muslims in Aragon, his kingdom, were not forced to convert until 1526, after Ferdinand had passed away. Here is an image by a German traveler, and it's a large, wonderful book called the Trachtenbuch, which is the book of costumes. And he traveled all over Europe making paintings and drawings of different costumes. And one of his images of the Moriscos of Granada shows one of these musical gatherings where we can see them dancing and playing with a variety of different musical instruments. The final expulsions are a little bit horrifying to read about. In the 1580s, the king and at that point Emperor Philip II became very worried that they were sort of a fifth column of Moriscos in his kingdom, and that they might be negotiating with the Ottoman Turks to try to bring about an invasion of Iberia. So in his council, they spoke about many different solutions for the Morisco problem. The Morisco problem involved the possible solutions that they discussed included loading them all in ships, sailing them out into the Atlantic, scuttling the ships, and thereby drowning all on board. Another idea was to deport them en masse to various locations in the New World, such as Newfoundland, and another possible solution was the forcible castration of all male Moriscos. In the end, the crown decided simply to expel its formerly Muslim subjects. Given 3 days' notice, the Moriscos of Valencia were ordered to assemble with whatever property they could carry, and by the end of November 1609, Valencia had been cleared of Moriscos, some 116,000 persons, who were then shipped over to the Spanish port of Oran, which is in modern Algeria, but held by the Spaniards at that time. They were taken to the boundaries of Spanish control and set loose in the desert, where many of them died of thirst, hunger, or were set upon by bandits, or taken in as captives and sold into slavery. Similar steps were then taken to forcibly expel the Moriscos of Aragon and Catalonia, and finally Castile. By 1614, the ethnic cleansing of Spain was complete. In part 3, we saw that Muslim and Jewish musicians and singers and dancers and performers from the South were a constant feature in the court life, among princes, kings, and also in private noble houses of the Christian North for a number of centuries, and that while they were in those courts, they were in constant contact with minstrels who had come from various places in Europe, who came and visited and returned, and that Spanish minstrels were also sent across France to Belgium, or rather Flanders, during the month of Lent to participate in the minstrel schools. So what I'd like to deal with in this last part of the presentation is what was the actual music that these people were performing? What was so special about Andalusi or Andalusian Arab music that was different from other places? And how and why has this amazing musical tradition lasted for over 1,000 years and continued on in modern musical traditions? In the early centuries, after the Arab conquest of 711, music in al-Andalus was nearly the same as it was in the Middle Eastern, in the Middle East or the Eastern Mediterranean, and musicians moved back and forth freely from Cordoba in Iberia to Baghdad, Damascus, Mecca, Medina in the East. Essentially, the courtly music We don't know much about the folk music or popular music, but the courtly music was a single shared tradition across the Arabic-speaking world, from Iberia all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean. But in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, a new song form emerged in al-Andalus that was distinctly Andalusian or Andalusi and made a tremendous impact on musical traditions around the Mediterranean. This song genre has two names in Arabic. One is muwashah and the other is zajal. Muwashah is for the song form if the lyrics are in classical Arabic, and if you compose that same type of song using colloquial Arabic, Arabs referred to it as zajal. Musically, they were essentially the same thing. So I'm going to treat them as one phenomenon here with two different types of lyrics, sometimes in classical Arabic and sometimes in colloquial Arabic. Again, this originated in the 10th and 11th century in al-Andalus, but it spread rapidly across the Arab Middle East. By the 12th century, we find this new song genre being all the rage, performed and imitated in North Africa, Egypt, Sham, which is another word for Syria, Iraq, and all the way down into Yemen. It is therefore one of the oldest continuously performed genres of music in the world. So what is special about this muwashah song form? Well, one of the things is that it has multiple rhymes. It gives the poet who creates the lyrics the freedom to create all sorts of different rhyme patterns. And at times, composers became more and more flamboyant, inserting more and more rhymes into the song. Another aspect is that they're alternating groups of long and short lines, which I will show you in just a moment. And the texts were comparatively long, that is, about 20 to 25 verses, sometimes more, sometimes less. But one of the key things is that they were simpler melodies designed for choral singing. The court music up to that point had been the exact opposite, and that is that these songs, they were called aswat, in the court, had very short texts, 2, 4, sometimes 6 verses long, but the music was extremely complicated. These were songs that could only be performed by well-trained professional singers. No possibility of singing along for fun or doing it in a chorus because of the complexity of the music. So here is a simpler type of music, but if you will, with a more complex and more ornamented text. One of the possible meanings of muwashah is that it refers to a type of sash or girdle that women used to wear that was called a wishah, and given the shape of the poem with the longer and shorter, it's possible that this is what suggested the idea of a muwashah as the name of this structure. And so sometimes in English people refer to them as girdle songs or girdle poems. Here you can see that this is a rhyme pattern where the A rhyme comes back over and over again, but in between each A rhyme, there is a different rhyme, B or C or D or E. And it was this back and forth between a continuous rhyme and changing rhyme that was one of the things that poets and composers of music and musicians and singers found particularly fascinating in that period of time. Here is a very early songbook. This may be a 16th century songbook from North Africa, from Algeria probably. And you can see, looking at it, even if you don't read Arabic, you can see the long versus the short verses. Remember that Arabic is written from right to left. So if you look at the far left-hand side of the page, at the top of the right-hand page, you can see a sort of fishhook type letter. That's the letter L in Arabic, lam, and you can see that that rhyme recurs, and then in between are different rhymes. the red word on the right-hand margin, which is qif, which means stop, marks the end of one song and the beginning of the next. And if you follow on to the next page on the left-hand side, looking down the left-hand pattern, you can see sort of a squiggle with a tail on it, which is the letter M. And you can see that that rhyme recurs over and over, but in between there are different rhymes. One of the fascinating aspects of this is that the muwashah became a shared Muslim Jewish tradition. Most Americans are completely unaware of the Sephardic side of Judaism. Ashkenazi Jews are those whose roots are traced to Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, and Sephardic Jews are those who trace their culture, their identity to the period of Muslim Spain, during the period of time in which they resided under Muslim rule in Iberia. In the year 1000, the vast majority of all the Jews of the world lived in al-Andalus and spoke Arabic as their mother tongue. They wrote treatises, scientific treatises, many different types of poetry, prose work, etc., all in Arabic. Sometimes they wrote Arabic with Hebrew characters, and we call this Judeo-Arabic, particularly if they were writing about a religious theme or theological topic. In any case, the vast Jewish population and the Muslim Andalusian population came to have a very shared culture in terms of literature and music. Muwashahs were originally very secular. The basic themes were love, poetry, wine drinking, garden settings with birds chirping, etc., etc. A lot of the pain of love, separation from the beloved, or unrequited love, where the beloved won't give the lover the time of day, how the lover is suffering, growing thin because he cannot eat, or pale because he stays awake at night imagining the beloved, etc. But eventually, this, in a fascinating fashion, got sort of turned around and reinterpreted in a sacred or mystical fashion. So on the Islamic side, we have Sufism, which is Islamic mysticism, and in the Sufi Sama, which is a musical ritual, they reinterpreted these lyrics in Arabic, and they said, well, the pining for the beloved is man's yearning for reunion with the Godhead. And all of the different images, such as the drunkenness and the wine drinking, is the ecstasy one feels when one truly opens one's heart to the love of God. On the Jewish side, Hebrew poets already in the 11th century began to write Hebrew muwashahat that were imbued with lots of biblical imagery, and they use these poems as lyrics for songs of two different genres, bakashot and piyutim. And they were devotional Hebrew lyrics. They were truly religious, but there were also Hebrew lyrics that might be called what we would say more secular, that is the wine drinking and beloved themes, but of course reinterpreted with that mystical sense that this is all an allegory for the search for God. And in more recent centuries, the Christian Arabs in places such as Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, etc., have adopted this Andalusian music as part of their own tradition. And in fact, one of the most famous singers of Andalusian music in modern times, muwashahat, is Fairuz, who is a female Christian Lebanese singer. We'll listen to a bit of her singing at the end of this presentation. This fascinating form, with its multiple rhymes and recurring rhymes and changing rhymes, etc., is closely related to the troubadour songs of southern France, of Provence and Occitane, and also in Catalonia, related to the forms of the songs in the Cantigas de Santa Maria and in the Gallego-Portuguese cantigas de amigo, from the beginning of the 12th century through to the beginning of the 14th century. The relationship is very highly disputed, exactly what should be attributed to Arab influence and what was just, independent innovation. So I won't deal with that. It would take an entire another lecture to untangle the many different arguments about this. But it is, of course, a very suggestive and fascinating thing that once the Arab muwashah began to spring up and disseminate around the Mediterranean, these other forms in medieval Castilian and in Portuguese, Catalan and Occitan and Provençal all began to appear as well. I have 3 video examples for you to look at, and I'm not going to try to pull them up onto this same screen. I've tried it a couple of times and it's really a little bit tricky. The first example is an orchestra in Fez, Morocco. And this is a very traditional performance of Andalusi muwashah, poetry, song, music, much as it might have been performed 100 years ago. You will see that the musicians are wearing very traditional costume with their slippers and their white, wide-cut outer garments. And what I'd like you to listen to in this short, it's only about 3 minutes long, this short example is, remember I showed you that there were repetitions of one rhyme and then moving on to a different rhyme. Well, the muwashah is also divided into 2 different melodic units. Where the A rhyme is, we find the same melody repeated, and when you shift the rhyme, you also shift to a different melody. And then you go back and forth between the 2 melodies, the way you go back and forth between the 2 sections of the song. So what I'd like you to listen to here is you'll hear a little bit of an instrumental prelude, and then they'll begin the song. And first you'll hear the solo singer, who has a rather high tenor voice. He will sing 1 verse. Then all of the musicians together will sing that same verse as a chorus. And then all of them will perform that same melody, that melody of that verse, once instrumentally. So you'll hear the first verse repeated 3 times, solo, chorus, instrumental. The second verse 3 times, solo, chorus, instrumental. Then the third verse, and at the end of the third verse, you should be able to hear very clearly a shift to a different melody. That is, they're changing to the second section of the muwashah, the other rhyme, and the other melody. So that's the key thing I would like you to take away from this short recording. But you should also take a look at the musical instruments. You will see the Moroccan rabab, which is essentially unchanged in form from the Middle Ages. You will see a couple of Arab lutes. You will see a large zither, which is called qanun. And of course, you will see a variety of different bowed string instruments that have been imported from the West in more recent times, violins and violas, but the musicians are performing them vertically on the knee rather than horizontally off the shoulder. The second video example is a fascinating one, and that is that it takes place in Israel, and it is an orchestra that is called the Israeli Andalusian Orchestra, which was set up by Moroccan Sephardic Jews to perform their musical tradition. That is the tradition that they shared with Muslims in Iberia and North Africa as well. And a beautiful poem called Yedid Nefesh. When you look at this, you will see that there are a couple of Moroccan musicians, such as the fellow who's playing the violin vertically on the knee, the drummer, the qanun player, the zither player. But there are also several other musicians who are not from this tradition. You will see that a couple of them are actually Russian classical musicians who have been brought in. This video is from the early days of this Andalusian orchestra. It has grown quite a bit since in the 20 years or so since it was first founded. Maybe 25 years, I guess. Anyway, you will hear the same thing. You will hear the muwashah poetry, muwashah form poetry, but in about 2 minutes into the recording, The music will sort of stop. There will be some improvisation on the violin, and then the singer will launch into this extraordinarily beautiful element of Andalusian music, and that is this sort of vocal improvisation. It's called an istikhbar in Arabic, and he will sing in a passage which I hope that you will find as moving as I do every time I hear it. And the third, also short example, each of these are only a couple of minutes long, is the famous Lebanese Christian singer Fayrouz singing a very short poem called لو كان قلبي معي. And I'm really giving you this. She is the most famous interpreter of Andalusian music in modern times. She did an album called Andalusiyat, Songs of al-Andalus, that was extremely popular, remains popular. It was first released in the 1960s. And so I want you to just hear the beauty of her voice and note the beauty of the song. So you will have to, of course, take these links and link into YouTube and listen on your own. But let me point out that I have given you the lyrics to the second and the third examples in the following slides. Here is the Yedid Nefesh, right? Beloved of the soul, compassionate Father, draw your servant to your will, then your servant will hurry like a hart to bow before your majesty. To him your friendship will be sweeter than the dripping of the honeycomb and any taste. Here's the original Hebrew English translation, and if you'd like to follow along, there's a transliteration so that you can attach the words as you hear them sung to the text. And here then is the last example, لو كان قلبي معي by Fayrouz. The Arabic is لو كان قلبي معي ما اخترت غيركم ولا رضيت سواكم في الهوى بدلا ولكنه رغيب في من يعذبه فليس يقبل لا لوما ولا عذلا. If only my heart were mine to control, I would never have chosen anyone else. I would never have accepted any substitute for you in love, but my heart desires the one who torments it and refuses to accept any blame or reproach. So with that, I will say in Arabic, أشكركم لحسن استماعكم. I thank you for the goodness of your listening. I hope that you've enjoyed these 4 presentations, and I look forward to having a live via Zoom question and answer session with you in August. Okay, good. So just as a way of a recap, you saw my PowerPoint presentation, I hope. There were 4 parts. And in the first part, I said that one easy way to show the connectedness of all of the musical traditions of the medieval Mediterranean going into the later Middle Ages and Renaissance is precisely, as James Milner has shown us, is to track the dispersion, the dissemination of musical instruments. And okay, louder, please, as I'm doing my best.
No, that's great. That right there is great.
All right. Okay. I guess I have to lean all the way in. You'll just have to put up with a large version of my face. Anyway, so I traced 2 different groups. One is the Arab lute, and then the other one, which may have been surprising, are the bowed string instruments. To realize that these really did not exist until the 8th century. And then they spread through the Islamic territories, through Sicily, Italy, and up through Spain, but also through the back door, if you will, from Central Asia, through Byzantium, and into Eastern Europe. And one of the things that I oftentimes pose to my own students is to stop and think about what our music now, or even Renaissance or classical music, would have sounded like if we did not have bowed string instruments. And even more so if you took the lute and the guitar out of the formula, what type of music would we end up with? Then in the second part, I focused on Moorish Spain, or al-Andalus, as we say in Arabic, in Hebrew, Sefarad, and tried to demonstrate the mixture and contact between different musical traditions by talking about biographies of individual musicians. Then in part 3, I moved the focus to Northern Iberia, to the Christian courts of Castile and Aragon and Catalonia, and showed how minstrels, Arab and Jewish musicians, were coming from the south, moving to the north, and were coming in contact with all sorts of European minstrels that were coming in from different countries. And so these northern courts of Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Catalonia were this meeting place of different types of music. And then finally, I tried to talk a little bit about the music itself, what we call Andalusian music or Andalusi music, what the song form was, and demonstrated a little bit of how that spread from medieval al-Andalus through to the modern world, following several different tracks, but one of them is simply the dispersal across the Arabic-speaking world in the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries, and how it's been rooted in regional traditions across the Arab world, but then also reminding people about the network of Sephardic Jewish communities who have also taken on this music and were participants from the very beginning, as you saw in my presentation. In the United States, when we talk about Sephardic music, people are almost always referring to Ladino music. That is Sephardic music that is sung in a sort of semi-medieval form of Castilian. And these are the romances, these sort of narrative ballads. But I always like to point out to people that there is an entire other side to the Sephardic tradition. And that is those Sephardic Jews who remained Arabic speakers and took this Arab language music with them after the expulsions from Spain to Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, to the Holy Land, to Egypt, different places that they went, and continued it in Arabic and in Hebrew. And I think I hope that the presentation elucidated that. One sort of easy fact to grab onto that sort of surprises many modern Americans, because we are so used to thinking of Arabs and Jews as being completely separate, is that in the year 1000, 90% of the Jewish population of the world lived under Muslim rule in various parts of the Middle East and spoke Arabic as their mother tongue. Hebrew was used for special purposes. It was not the language of daily life. So there is a sort of fascinating medieval story that has much to do with late medieval and Renaissance culture in Europe that gets sort of lost because of the focus, at least in the United States and modern Europe, on the Ladino-speaking side of the Sephardic tradition. So maybe I'll ask if there are any pressing questions right to begin with. Otherwise, what I would like to do is to walk you through the 3 examples that I listed at the end of my PowerPoint, and then I'll throw in another example that I just pulled up to talk about Lucia's, or Lucia, I don't know how you pronounce your name, question about modes. Does anybody have a question they would like to pose before we listen to some music?
I don't see any hands up right now unless...
All right, so then let's...
Lucia, did you want to say something? You're muted. Yeah.
All right.
I was really interested and fascinated by the use of women for, as the concubines or whatever. They were concubines. But I was wondering if you could talk about, in the context of the Islamic slave trade, how there were so many of, well, you made it, from what I gathered, it was quite a significant amount of women who were used as, who were highly trained and then taken to, the al-Andalus or other areas of the Islamic world for the purpose of not only being part of the harem, but also, entertainment, and also some of them becoming, extremely learned. So I was wondering if you could talk about that in the context of the Islamic slave trade, and also, were males also taken and trained so you know, so in such a targeted fashion, or were the males taken mostly in the like military with military slaves, or you know, slaves meant to serve in the military or something like that? That was my question, because oftentimes we don't know a lot about the particulars of the Islamic slave trade, and I know the focus is on music, but that was just so fascinating.
Mm-hmm. So some quick answers. In terms of music, there were not really very many male slaves, and there was not a sort of institutionalized form of training male slave singers the way the women were trained, these qiyan, these female slave singers slash entertainers. So there was not really a male equivalent. Male singers were free most of the time. And we have all these wonderful narratives of them being discovered, you know, a good singer walking by a construction site and hearing a construction worker's, okay, I'm going to lean in, hearing a construction worker sing from the building he was building. And the singer realizes that he has a beautiful voice and calls him down and immediately offers him an apprenticeship. Or another young fellow who was working as an apprentice potter doing ceramics and was singing to himself and is discovered. So people knew that you could become, you know, even famous and rather wealthy by becoming a good singer. Male singers were looking for young singers to train, but most often they weren't slaves. The female side of things, as I said, very much the female singers were almost all, I would say, well over 80% were slaves, which meant that they were recognized when they were young, probably for having good looks, but also having a voice and being clever with music, and they were trained. And then these women, you know, even though they remained slaves, became almost self-supporting and independent in their old age. One of the interesting things about Islamic slavery, which is also true of Roman slavery, right, is that in Islam, slaves could own slaves. So a female singer could be owned by a very wealthy patron, but she could also go out and buy young girl slaves, train them as singers, turn around and sell them, and then she either got all of the profit from that or had to split individual agreements with her patron. In the overall, you know, map of Islamic slavery, there are many different types of slaves. As you said, for men, one of the major points, especially in the later Middle Ages, was to be drafted as slaves into the military. And that lasted all the way into the Ottoman Empire. So that lasted for over 1,000 years. And whether, you know, the degree to which they sometimes were considered, they were bought as slaves, but became free, if you will, after their training quite a bit of the time. So that is just a brief answer there. Any other questions, or shall I move on to a video example?
Yeah, go right ahead. Don't forget to
All
click
right.
that check
Yes,
mark
the
of
share
computer sound. Yeah.
Computer share, computer sound. So the first one, do we all see that?
Yes.
All right. So this is, now, did the sound come through?
It sure did.
All right. So this is from Morocco. This is a traditional performance of Andalusi music. So many of the texts, the poems that they are singing, were actually written in the Middle Ages. You know, a lot of them were also written later in imitation of the Andalusi style. And if we start on the left, you can see a violin that is being played vertically on the knee, right? Which was the Middle Eastern style. It looks like this is slightly larger. I assume this is a viola. In the third person, he is the solo singer. He's not playing an instrument. Another viola, that might be a violin or viola. But then here is the rabab, one of the instruments that I talked about. We saw images of next to the lute, a second lute, and then a drum. So what I use this example to demonstrate is the form of the muwashah that I spoke about in the fourth part of my PowerPoint. And I talked about the fact that there were sort of 3 repetitions of the melody and then changed to a different melody. So what we're going to hear here is one single verse, first being sung by the soloist, then being repeated by all of the instruments, the musicians, as a chorus, then a third time instrumentally with no singing, and that's just the first verse. Then we'll hear the second verse, we'll hear the third verse, and then after the third verse, we'll listen for the change to the contrasting melody. And we'll just stop there. So that's what I want to demonstrate with this. So I hope what you heard is the three verses moving into the contrasting melody. And as I said, these songs in Hebrew and in Arabic are based on the idea of 2 different melodies. Move from the first melody to the second melody and back again and all the way through the song. So a lot of the Andalusian music across the Middle East is choral singing with soloists like we have heard. And quite frankly, many of these concerts can go on for hours. The Moroccan repertory has almost 1,000 songs in it. There's a standard songbook that you can buy, and people love this music. If you go to Morocco and someone says, we're going to take you to hear classical Moroccan music, this is what they're talking about. And people will sit and listen to this for hours at a time. And the second example that I gave you is important for 2 different reasons. One, it shows the importance of this same type of music in the Sephardic Jewish community. And we're going to listen to the Israeli Andalusian Orchestra, a group that was founded in the late 1980s. Israel, of course, has a national symphony, but it basically performs Western art music or classical music, Beethoven and Brahms, etc. And the particularly Moroccan Jews felt that their portion of Jewish culture was not represented in that orchestra. So with funding from the government, they founded this orchestra, the Israeli Andalusi Orchestra. But the second thing that I really love about this clip is not only is it a beautiful example of that, but in these hours of performances, there are these intensely emotional moments where the singer breaks off from the rhythm and begins to improvise. And so this is called in Morocco and Algeria, it's called an istighfar. And so this is an example of this young male singer. He's now about 45, so this is from the 90s. Where you'll hear this same repetition of the melody that we just noticed, and then you will hear the sort of break in the rhythm, There will be an instrumental, a violin improvisation, and then the singer will improvise, which I hope you will find beautiful, which I always love listening to. This is from the early days of this orchestra, and at that point they had trouble finding musicians, and so they incorporated a number of Russian Jewish musicians as well. So you will see some people playing the violin vertically. Those are people whose origins are from Morocco. And then you'll see a couple of sort of blonde-haired, a cellist and a violinist who are playing more classical style. And these were group musicians that were brought in. You will also see a banjo. And believe it or not, a banjo is not a classical medieval Andalusian instrument. But it does sound like another early instrument. So we're going to listen to this in the PowerPoint. And I think I can find this. Let me see if I can share this for just a second. I want to show you that I have given you the text in transliteration, Hebrew script, and English translation. All right, can we see that? Susan, can you see this?
Yes, I do see it. Thank you.
All right, good. So I can't show you this and the video at the same time, but in the PowerPoint that you have, here is the actual poem, and you can follow it through in the transliteration, and here is a translation. So let us go. Share computers and. Okay, so Binyamin Buzaglo, all right, Yedid Nefesh.
يديد نفش طبها الرحمن مشوف عبدك الريت معك يلا لا عزتي تحزن ذاتي تربي ذاي تلا سمحات علا يلا لا سيباي خرني وشعري خاري بسادتي خسابي وصفيري بسمتي خد كود شمشوطي خميري مزلزلت بين خيام مزلزلت بين خيام.
Oops. Okay. Any comments or questions about that? Did everybody hear the break with the improvisation, right? Which was the main thing I was looking for in that.
I was just curious. I'm sorry. I was curious because the first one you played for us, it was interesting time signature. I felt. I was wondering what time, if they play around with time signatures. I mean, that one was pretty straightforward.
Right. So excellent question. So none of the rhythms are going to be easily. Yes, Karima, I will give you the name of the singer in just a moment. The music in Morocco of Andalusian is broken into 5 different rhythms.
Oh, wow.
Actually quite complex. So none of them are like 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, or 6/8. And the way we do rhythms, the easiest way is we oftentimes in the culture, in Arab culture and in Sephardic Jewish culture as well. So you have a drum, and if you play the sound in the middle of the drum, you get a deep sound, which is dum. And then if you take your fingers and play at the edge of the drum, you get tek. And so instead of thinking it, we do use time signatures when we Westerners transcribe it. So we'll say it's in 5/4 or 3/4 or something like that. But the structure is actually based on recurring patterns of these deep and light, and is the word for blank. So a very typical, all across the Middle East is called wahda wa nus, which is dum tek, tek dum, tek dum tek, tek dum tek. And classical rhythms in Morocco can be up to 16 beats long. And when you go to the eastern side of the Arab world, you also get 32s. And in Ottoman music, you get 64-beat rhythms.
Wow.
So you can feel sort of a downbeat on some of them, like the second one had a stronger downbeat.
Yeah.
But in fact, what's going on is far more complex. Yes.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay, we have Michael Eisenberg.
I just have a quick question since you addressed the rhythm in that. So do any of these rhythmic cycles in here in like flamenco? I've heard a little bit about the cycles there. Is there any kind of residual rhythmic information that gets passed there, or is it not at all?
Let's see. So the problem with, we have modern flamenco and we have modern Andalusian music from places like Morocco. And if we're trying to link the two, you would have to go back historically. And unfortunately, we actually don't really know what those rhythms were a couple centuries ago, because people didn't transcribe them. Even if they transcribed notation, they did not have a notation system that that showed us these rhythmic patterns. So we can find parallels, but it's not clear that there's any direct link in terms of a specific rhythm here in modern flamenco and a specific rhythm here in Morocco. One of the reasons we know that these rhythms changed over the centuries is that we can look at Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia and Libya and Egypt, and they very oftentimes have rhythms that they label with the same name, right? And then when you go to the regional traditions, these are oral traditions. When you go to to the actual region, if you go to the city of Fez in Morocco, and they have a rhythm called Batahi. And I've studied in Fez and I studied in Tlemcen, which is Western Algeria, just over the Atlas Mountains. And they were connected. They both had very strong Jewish communities. We know that people went back and forth in the Middle Age. They also have a rhythm, and it's also called Batahi. And then if you play it Fessi style, they say, oh, that's not ours. That's the Moroccan style. So what's supposed to be the same rhythm and the same name, this is all true of melodic modes, and I'll talk to Lucia's question a little bit later with the last example. It turns out that there are regional variations. And so given the amount of regional variation that we find across the modern Arab world or modern North Africa, we have to assume that the same type of transformation via oral tradition has been happening on the flamenco side as well.
This Israeli band that we were listening to, they are trained. Are they Moroccan? Are they trained in that Moroccan tradition, or are they just different, coming out of different traditions?
Yes, so that ensemble, as I said, this is from the early 1990s. That video, so they were still using some Russian musicians.
Oh, okay.
But as they grew, and now they actually grew so large, they've now become two orchestras. So there now are two Israeli Andalusi orchestras, one based in Ashdod and one based in Ashkelon, down in the south. And it is, in particular, they split up for an interesting reason. And that is, Andalusi music typically had a standard, the original Arabic lyrics of a song, or the original Hebrew lyrics of the song, were pretty secular. They were all about drinking wine in beautiful gardens, listening to nightingales and birds, and singing about the beloved. And although mystical traditions, right, tended to interpret that as, well, yearning for the beloved is actually yearning from God. And the wine is not actually wine, it's actually the ecstasy we feel as we approach the Godhead. Things
Exactly.
like that. But if you were just read the lyrics as they are, prima facie, you say, this is basically a love song or a wine drinking song. But both in Arabic and in Hebrew, people then began to compose truly religious devotional lyrics. So in the Moroccan tradition, these are piyutim. So piyutim is a type of paraliturgical or liturgical song that's found very widely in the different branches of the Jewish world. Bakashot are not so common among Ashkenazi Jews, but are very common among Sephardic and particularly Moroccan Jews. These are vigil songs. They are songs to be sung at the very late night or early morning. And so people would take the same melody. And so we have centuries of Jewish songbooks from Morocco that have, for example, a Hebrew lyric that is devotional. It's a piyut, or it's one of the bakashot. But on the top, it says in Judeo-Arabic, that is Arabic written in Hebrew characters, sung to the tune of, and then it gives the opening Arabic line of the original song, much the way we would say sung to the tune of Yankee Doodle. So there are scholars, there's a wonderful scholar, Edwin Sarusi, a dear friend of mine in Israel, this is his main area of research, are the Moroccan Jewish tradition of Andalusian music. He won the Israel Prize in 2018, so he's considered a major figure in the Israeli intellectual world. But in North Africa, all right, when we're talking about the Jews of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, the Isle of Jerba, and even into Libya, everybody is singing in Arabic. Arabic was, and has been for centuries, their native tongue. And Hebrew is used for specific purposes, more devotional purposes, etc. So this was the major Moroccan, North African Jewish tradition.
I'm sorry, and never Ladino? Ladinos never figures at all?
Very little. So in Morocco, you might not know that in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Spanish conquered an enclave up in the upper part of Morocco. So Franco actually started his revolution from the Spanish Morocco. So in that area of Spanish Morocco, the Jews did speak Spanish, all right? Although they have a special dialect, which is, if you will, a branch of Ladino, but it's called Hakatiya. And so the Jews of Tangiers, right, spoke this special type of Spanish called Hakatiya, and they also sing these romances. But the broader Ladino tradition, no, didn't play much of a role in the Arabic-speaking world. It did in the Ottoman Empire. It did in Greece, Thessalonica, in Istanbul, etc. One of the great scholars of this Hakatiya tradition is a wonderful singer-performer named Vanessa Paloma. And so she has recordings of this, wrote a dissertation recently for the Sorbonne in Paris, all about this Jewish enclave up in the north that shares the Ladino world as opposed to the Arabic-speaking world.
Well, thank you so much. We have, I'd like to banish the evil timekeeper, but I do want to keep, so perhaps you can take us out with your last example, and we thank you so much. This has been so enriching and absolutely underscores the Connected Histories theme.
All right, good. So the last example, and I will point out that the words are also in the PowerPoint. If you ask modern Arabs in the Middle East about Andalusi music, or songs from al-Andalus, the singer's name that immediately pops onto everybody's lips is Fairuz, who is a Lebanese Christian singer. She's still very much alive today. She is sort of considered the living superstar, although she doesn't, I think she's in her 80s at this point and doesn't perform except occasionally with her son, Ziad Rahbani. But she is famous. In the 1960s, she released an album of songs from al-Andalus, Andalusiyet, and one of them is this song. Let me show you the words very briefly. And I love this also because of the, if you will, almost universal expression of love. She sings, "If only my heart were mine to control, I would never have chosen anyone else but you in love. I would never have accepted a substitute for you in love. But my heart has a mind of its own. It desires the one who torments it, and it refuses to accept any blame or reproach." So a very short 2-verse song sung in the beautiful voice of Fairuz.
لو كان قلبي معي ما اخترت غيركم ولا رضيت سواكم في الهوى بدلا لو كان قلبي معي ما اخترت غيركم ولا رضيت سواكم في الهوى بدلا لكنه راغب في من يعذبه لكنه راغب في من يعذبه وليس يقبلنا لوما ولا عذلا.
All right, with that, I thank you. As we say in Arabic, ashkurukum li husni istima'kum. I thank you for the goodness of your listening. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me.